Hi, welcome back to Humanities. Today we are going to be turning our attention away from the ancient Near East, which we've been focusing on quite a bit, and moving into the Aegean world, the Bronze Age. This is going to be the beginning of our investigation of the ancient Greek world, and we need to start at the very beginning, which I think is appropriate, and it's also one of the most interesting periods, at least from my perspective, of ancient Greek history. If you could actually call it history, because we don't have very many written records yet, though we do have writing introduced in this particular period, and we'll talk about that as we begin. So I think we should dive in, and we're going to start actually not with the Greeks themselves, but with some of the people that are going to be very influential on the development of early Greek civilization, particularly the civilization of the ancient Minoans. So if you are not familiar with this era, this particular territory or location, I'm going to introduce you again to some geography. We're going to start with some maps. We're going to look at a few things. And I know visually this might not be the easiest thing to pick up on, at least reading these maps. That's one of the problems using PowerPoint in this kind of format. But what you're looking at is essentially the Aegean world. You've got the mainland of what is now called Greece on the left, and on the right you've got Anatolia, present-day Turkey. And this region, which is really littered by hundreds of islands, is basically bordered on the south by the largest island, which is the island of Crete. Now, the Minoan civilization is going to be primarily situated on Crete, though it's going to have a number of islands that it either influences or colonizes. It's hard to really know, but you are going to have Minoan influence spread throughout some of these islands, particularly in the Cyclades region, which is kind of in the central portion of the Aegean. And it's going to have an impact on the people of the mainland, though the people of the mainland are technically not Minoans. Now, when I use the term Minoan, it's probably also good to point out that we're using a modern designation. We don't know what these people called themselves. We get the name from the mythology, right? The city that we're going to concentrate on in a second. And let me actually bring us to a bigger map of Crete. We're going to focus in here because this, like I said, is a center piece of Minoan civilization. And the most important center in Crete, or on Crete, is the palace and city at Knossos, which is on the north coast. It's right there about the center of the island. And the later Greeks told a lot of stories related to the city of Knossos, in particular dealing with the king by the name of Minos, or Minos. And that's where the archaeologists today have gotten the name for the civilization. Okay, it's called Minoan civilization after this famous mythical king. Now, this was the largest site. It's a fantastic archaeological site. If you ever go to the Greek islands, I would say do not miss Crete, and definitely don't miss Knossos if you can help it. But there are a number of other palaces and city centers, particularly on the eastern portion of the island. That's where the majority of the bigger centers are located. So Phaistos, Malia, Karazakro are some of the other big ones. But they're all smaller than Knossos. I'd say they pale in comparison. That might be a little bit of an overstatement in a negative direction. They're definitely smaller. Okay, so Knossos is the one that we're going to actually look the most at in the course of this presentation. And I know as you guys do your presentations, one of the presentation topics is actually on Knossos, the architecture and the mythology and stuff like that. So I'm probably not going to unpack as much as I would like to, because I'm going to let you guys do some of that in your presentation time. Moving into this next visual, you've got just kind of the highlighted areas focusing on the Minoan areas in the dark. Okay, so the black highlighted areas, not that you're going to highlight with black, but you know what I mean. The black islands are going to be where you have the largest amount of Minoan influence. And again, Crete on the south. The other territories in the white, like I said, are not unaffected by Minoan culture. As a matter of fact, even in Egypt, you will have some contact with Minoan Crete and some trade, and there's some indications of influence there as well. As a matter of fact, when you look at Minoan art itself, there may be a little bit of Egyptian influence there, though it's definitely distinct if you ever look at the two side by side. Now, going into kind of a chronology, I'm going to set up general time periods. Now, we don't have a lot of really, the further back you go, I've said this in the past, the more general the dates are going to be. So between, let's say, 3300 and about 2000 BC, you've got essentially the Cycladic culture. And we don't know very much at all about Cycladic culture. And this would be dealing with the islands. If I go back a slide, where you see, Paros right in the center there, that's essentially the Cyclades. Okay, those islands right in the middle of the Aegean. Now, again, no written records in this period at all. The most famous archaeological remains from the Cycladic culture would be the figurines that were found in the graves on the islands, and some of them are illustrated on, or not illustrated, but I've showed to you on the screen here. And these definitely are Neolithic era, early Bronze Age levels of civilization. So remember, terms like that refer to the level of technology. So we're still talking people working with stone tools. Neolithic era, of course, agriculture has already been introduced. And then early bronze would be when bronze weaponry would start to become at least more common. Now, the Minoans are going to impact the Cyclades when the Minoan civilization really gets rolling. So between 2200 and 2000, kind of near the tail end of this period, you're going to start to see more and more Minoan influence, which is why those islands that I showed you a second ago were in the black on the last visual. These figurines are still kind of mysterious. We don't know what they were for exactly. They were found in graves. If you look at all of these examples were definitely not meant to stand up. Okay, you could tell by the feet, particularly on the model to the right of the screen, the way they're pointed down. So they were laying down in a recumbent position, the arms across the chest in all of these. Definitely female figurines, as you could tell by the very rough anatomical details that were added later. The heads look a little bit like you'd think of Easter Island type figurines. So definitely humanoid. Even the one on the left, the far right, I was right the right time. The left-hand side of the screen, you've got this fiddle type figurine, which is also, again, a female anatomy, but no head at all in this one. Okay, now some of them get a lot more elaborate. Some of them are even playing instruments and things like that. But I look at the fiddle figurine on the left. I always think of like little bobbleheads. I don't know if there's just missing a piece that used to sit on top. But again, they're not trying to capture actual human characteristics. These are, again, and who knows exactly what they're for. This is the type of thing archaeologists have a lot of fun time speculating on. But they're definitely interesting and very, very distinct. Okay, but we don't want to settle down in the Cycladic area. We want to move on to the Minoan era. So let's say 2600 to about 2000. We're going to call this period the early Minoan period. And you're going to start to see the first cities begin to emerge in Crete. But it's a pre-palace stage. So you're going to have the palaces, which are the most important features, develop kind of in the transitional period between early and middle Minoan. So when we move into the middle Minoan, 2000 to 1500, you're going to start to see more complicated architecture, these palace structures. And what you see in the visual there is a schematic of the site of Knossos. And you really can't get a feel for how large this site is, but it covered acres of territory, hundreds of rooms, and it was built up to 4 or 5 levels high. Which is impressive for, again, the time period to have multi-storied structures. But around 2000, we could talk about these first palaces coming in. Knossos, which we're showing, and Phaistos, another one around the same time. The Old Palace period is going to be the time period till about 1700. Around 1700, you're going to have a destruction. That destruction is going to wreck a number of the palaces, but it's not going to stop occupation. You're actually going to have a reconstruction pretty quickly. Now, if you know anything about the Aegean world, it was definitely prone to earthquakes. So most likely the damage that we see at these periods, at these points, is due to natural disaster. Now, the other visual that just popped up, which is going to be something that dates to around 2000 or so BC. This is an example of Minoan pictograph, because the Minoans actually did have writing. And I think we saw before that usually when you have civilizations develop, cities and that complicated, division of labor and the structure of the way these cities are set up. You also have, along with it, very often written records. Now, this is called the Phaistos disc. It's an example, again, of a pictographic writing system, which, again, is using pictures as opposed to syllables or, a syllabic system or even an alphabet, which is probably the best out of all. How it was read, very difficult to know. Well, actually, what it says, we can't decipher at all. I haven't mentioned yet, that the Minoan language is unknown to us. So where we do have written records, unfortunately, we can't read any of these written records. So we have to rely on archaeology and maybe later myths and legends that the Greeks told, just to give us an idea about, at least some vague idea about the Minoan world. Anyways, the interesting thing about this particular example of pictograph is the way it's written, kind of in this spiraling pattern, starting in the center probably. And you can imagine how difficult if this was the way they normally wrote. It's hard to even say. As far as I know, this is a very unique item. But it's not a very convenient way to read. So, where you have to, turn this thing as you read it, almost like a steering wheel. Probably used in some kind of religious or ritualistic setting would be my guess. But again, that's all it is a guess. After that, you move into the New Palace period. So from the rebuilding after the destruction in 1700 to about 1500, this is usually called the High Minoan or Middle Minoan III. It's going to have its biggest impact during this era, particularly on the mainland of Greece. Okay, and again, here's a good visual of possibly what the palace at Knossos would have looked like. This is obviously an artist's reinterpretation based on the archaeology. Even the photo that you see, which is actually taken at the site of Knossos, is essentially an artist's reconstruction. When Arthur Evans, who's the archaeologist that basically purchased the site and excavated it back in 1900, did his excavations, he partially reconstructed portions of the palace. And there are debates as to whether he did a good job, whether there was a little bit of artistic license involved. But here you see the piecing together some of the frescoes that were covering the walls. You can actually see in this particular photo, an older layer of fresco with a newer layer of fresco over the top of it. Okay, you can see the plaster kind of where it's, the lower and upper layers. It's hard to see actually in this visual, but if you're ever to go there, you'd be able to see it pretty clearly, or in a better photo. The replacement for the pictographic form of writing is something that we call Linear A. That started to come into use around 1700, and this is a syllabic system, but again, we don't know the language, so it's not very useful for us. They're actually used simultaneously for a little while, so you don't see pictograph disappear right away. It's probably for another century in use, and then it kind of phases out, and the Linear A is going to be what is going to remain until the end of Minoan civilization. Now, there's another major destruction that takes place, and dating this one is actually a debate between geologists and archaeologists, and I've seen different dates. Back when I was in grad school, I think most people put it around 1500, though I think it's been moved back to at least 1600 or thereabouts. It's the eruption of an island, a volcanic island by the name of Thera. Today, that island is known as Santorini, and if you ever, do a Google search for, Greek islands, some of the visuals that are going to come up almost every time are going to be pictures of the island of Santorini. This is one of the most beautiful sites in all of the Aegean, but it's a volcano and it's still an active volcano. At the time of the Minoans, it was a more or less round island. But during this explosion, which was apparently one of the largest explosions in human history, the entire center of the island blew up. If you go and look at photos of Santorini today, it's basically this little crescent-shaped island with this big, the caldera, which is the center of the volcano, is basically underwater. And that's the inside of that crescent is where the volcano used to be. Now, there are ruins that date back to this eruption, and the one that I've shown you in the bottom corner of the screen is a buried city known as Akrotiri. This is basically like the Pompeii of the ancient Minoan world. And you can see a lot of Minoan architectural elements if you go here. I forget when this site opened back up, back when I was first actually doing graduate studies in Greece. And I was in Crete. I wasn't able to get into Akrotiri. I know, I forget how many years back it was now, but back in the early 2000s when I returned, I was able actually to get in. The site had been open to the public. I think it had been closed for maybe renovations, but anyways, it is open presently today, and it's worth visiting, though most people don't really know about it. Most people that go to Santorini, see Ia Village and some of the other really attractive modern villages, but don't really realize that there's this really, really important site from the earliest civilization in Europe right there on the island, and that's Akrotiri. Anyways, the palaces are again damaged by earthquake, which is probably related to the eruption at Thera. You can imagine the nearby, this is just north of Crete, with an eruption of the size and magnitude that this one is supposed to have been. There would have been, probably tidal waves as well as other earthquakes accompanying it. So we do know that there was some destruction around this time, and we don't know how much of an impact this has on the collapse of Minoan civilization. You have to speculate as to what kind of damage was done to the palaces. We do know that there were still people living at the palaces after this period, so whatever damage took place was again, fixed. But you do see a shift in who's occupying the palaces very soon afterward. Now, it's not immediately afterward, so as to what exactly transpires, all we know is that we move into the late period around 1500, and this is going to go to about 1,000. And around 1450 or so, these palaces are not only destroyed, at least most of the palaces are destroyed. Palaces like Knossos are reoccupied by new people that we're going to call the Mycenaeans. And the writing that is now found dating to about this period is going to be a different system. It's called Linear B. And actually, we can read Linear B because Linear B is evidence of Greek writing. Okay, so what we seem to have at this point is Greek people arriving in Crete for the first time, displacing the Minoans, maybe conquering the Minoans. It's hard to say. Now, Minoan culture, being primarily on the islands, was a culture that survived on trade. I already mentioned contact with Egypt. It's because they were great seafaring people. They had a lot of activity through shipping. It's also indicated by some of the artwork that we get in Minoan Crete. So you'd imagine they would have kind of control of the sea in that part of the Aegean, and possibly relied on their navy to possibly keep themselves safe. What I didn't mention with all this wonderful architecture that they developed is a complete absence of defensive fortifications. The Minoans didn't have walls, which tends to indicate, walls around their cities. Obviously, they had walls in their buildings, but around their cities, they didn't have defensive walls, which indicates possibly that the cities in the island itself were friendly towards one another, not necessarily under the same rule. Maybe there wasn't a single king that ruled all of these cities, but they probably cooperated somewhat, because usually when cities do not cooperate with their neighbors, they do tend to build walls. They didn't seem to have a very big influence or emphasis on military artwork, weaponry, things like that. It's not that you don't see some weapons and pictures of shields and stuff on the walls of their palaces, but they definitely didn't seem to be a militaristic society. So it's possible that they really did rely on the sea for protection as well as for communication and trade and their economy. You can imagine then that if there was this explosion that resulted in tsunami, tidal waves or destruction that very well could have wrecked the economy by wrecking the fleet, wrecking their ability to, it would take a while probably to rebuild after something like that. And maybe it would have been a period of vulnerability where you can easily have the people from the mainland, these new Mycenaeans, come in without much opposition. Okay, so that's at least one of the theories as to the connection between the eruption at Thera and the new shift. Again, if the eruption was 100 years earlier, it's going to be hard to tie these things together as kind of a cause-effect relationship. I'm just kind of throwing that out there. So it's, again, one of those debates as to when this thing should be dated and what kind of impact it actually has on the actual fall of the Minoan civilization. But what apparently does bring it down is these new Mycenaean people. After the arrival of the Mycenaeans, you have occupation, but it's only temporary. So maybe 1450 to about 1380, we've got the Greeks present, and then we move into a post-palatial period where apparently the Mycenaeans themselves are withdrawing from the cities, the centers in Crete. What is happening that leads to that? Again, a matter of speculation. Then finally, you move into the late phase of the Minoan, late Minoan, where you have, again, more destruction. And people at one point used to identify this with what is known as the Dorian invasion. I've got a question mark on the screen because we don't know whether there was any such thing as a Dorian invasion. As a matter of fact, when I was in grad school, that was a common theory that, the end of the early Mycenaean era is associated with this particular invasion known as the Dorian invasion or migration. Today, I think very few people hold to that anymore. So I'm just going to put it out there as, a possibility, and we'll just leave it at that. But I'm going to deal with that more in a second because we're about to shift from Crete to the mainland. So here you have the mainland Greece in the Mycenaean era. Now, the Mycenaeans, again, would not have been the name that they called themselves, except for maybe people that lived at the city center known as Mycenae. You can see it on the map in the region that's known as the Peloponnesus. The Peloponnesus is that lower portion of mainland Greece that's connected by this little isthmus to the upper portion of mainland Greece. So where you see Athens, that is the region known as Attica. The little isthmus is the land bridge that connects Attica to the southern portion. It looks kind of like a hand with the fingers coming downward. And Mycenae, which is with the red dot there, that would be the most important center in this period of the Bronze Age. And this is why archaeologists and historians refer to the era as the Mycenaean era and the culture as the Mycenaean culture. We also use the term Hellatic. So this term Hellatic refers to just the Bronze Age Greek culture of this era, okay, as opposed to the Hellenic period, which is going to follow. Now, of course, like Minoan is broken down into early, middle, late Minoan, you do the same thing with the Hellatic, but I'm not going to get into all those different, subcategories. We're just going to highlight general periods or the larger periods. So the Mycenaeans, again, as we call them, are Greeks. Now, in the beginning, when people were first uncovering this civilization, people didn't know exactly what they were. But luckily, like I said, they left writing behind, and the writing we can read. So this writing has been deciphered as Greek. So we know that they have arrived in the mainland. When they arrived, probably close to around 2000. But the important period, or the period of their real dominance, is going to be between about 1600 and 1100 BC. And I listed a few of the big centers. Mycenae, definitely the most important. There's a really impressive citadel built up on the top of the mountain. And we guess it's the leading state, and the theory that it was the leading state, generally due to mythology, going back to the Homeric epics, and we'll talk about that in a second. You've got Gla, which is up into the region of Boeotia, one of the larger enclosures, but not all the cities were actually fortified here either. Thebes, for instance, was unfortified. Tiryns, which is right there by Mycenae, had a really impressive fortress. Pylos, on the other side of the Peloponnesus, you can see that on the left or west coast of the Peloponnesus, was unfortified. Very important archaeological site there because of the written records that were found. You have most of the written records from the period found at Pylos. Iolkos, up in the far north on the map, that would be a city associated with a very famous hero, Jason. And then not on the map, across the Aegean in Anatolia, is the city of Miletus. Miletus was a Mycenaean era city, probably fairly important. Milawata is what the Hittites refer to it as, so we know that it was occupied. during that period. And we talked about the Hittites, if you remember, back when we did the historical overview of the ancient Near East. So I'm going to bring them up a few times today because the Hittites did seem to have some interaction with the Mycenaeans. And then you have Athens, the last one on the list, and it's probably because it's not one of the more important Mycenaean cities, though it will become obviously one of the most important later Greek cities. Okay, so Athens, kind of minor here. And it's the only city, Mycenaean era citadel, to remain largely affected by the collapse of the Mycenaean era, where we'll talk a little bit later, all these cities are eventually destroyed. Athens kind of remains unaffected. So let's go into the written records. I mentioned that they have writing. The writing they have is called Linear B, and it was definitely a adoption from the Minoans. Okay, there's very close similarities between Linear A and Linear B. As a matter of fact, on the screen you could see some examples of Linear B script next to Linear A script, so you can see how close they are, though they're not obviously the exact same thing. And on certain syllables you have very different illustrations. But like I said, the person that deciphered Linear B took a guess, tried to assume the Greek language as a background for it, and was able to eventually start to decipher little pieces and then kind of unravel the puzzle. So this was really, really important. And I'm going to get to some of the things that we know from these texts a little bit, maybe on our next lecture when we talk about religion. But primarily they're inventories, documents that relate to religious ritual, things like that. You don't have any what we'd call literature, I guess. No stories, no histories, no chronicles. We don't have names of kings as far as we know, though you do have names of gods and deities. Okay, and this is the earliest Greek that we have. As far as the system, like I said, it's syllabic. So you've got not only syllabic designations, but you also have ideographs, which would have represented ideas and not sounds. So a syllable, of course, would be a sound, basically a consonantal and vowel sound combined, as opposed to an alphabet, which usually tries to capture a single sound, like a vowel sound or a consonantal sound. So you're going to have a lot more symbols in a syllabic system than you will in an alphabet. Anyways, where they're found, Knossos has a great deal. That's the majority of them are actually found in Crete, which is where the Mycenaeans probably picked up their written system in the first place. And then at Pylos, like I said, on the mainland, you've got a large find of tablet, over 1,000 of them there, and then a few also at Mycenae. Other places didn't really leave written records as far as we can tell. Now, the chronology, if we go back to actually pre-Mycenaean era, I'd say this is Mycenaean chronology, but strictly speaking, it's not. This is pre-Mycenaean, around 3,000 to about 2,000 BC. It's called the early Helladic period, and there were already people living here long before the Greeks arrived. Now, what we call these people, it's hard to say. The word Pelasgian has been used to describe this pre-Greek group of people, and there is a lot of speculation as to whether this is an appropriate term to use, what the term even means. The ancient Greeks used the term. It's used of people around the region of Arcadia, kind of in central northern Peloponnese. You've got the term used by some of the ancient Greek poets in a certain sense, speculating as to the etymology, actually connecting it to birds. But modern scholars have debated as to what exactly it means as well, and we don't really know if it refers to nearby peoples, peoples of the flatland. Some people have speculated that it has reference to the sea and might refer to peoples of the sea or something along those lines. So it's really hard to know. As a matter of fact, the thing that makes it even more confusing is it seems to also be used of Greeks at certain periods, right? So certain writers will use it in different ways. So it's not used consistently even among the ancients or the modern scholars. So I'm just going to go ahead and use it in applying it to the pre-Greek inhabitants. Don't know that much about them. They were farming people. They had most likely, and again, this gets into religious speculation and mythological speculation, a lot of people assume some kind of matriarchal religion, the worship of the mother goddess. And again, there's only so much you can reconstruct from ancient mythology, and it's probably dangerous to even go there right now. So the biggest site, or the most impressive architectural remains from this era, is the House of Tiles at Lerna, which dates to between 2500 and 2300. And this is basically a place, I mean, the tiles from the roof that were found in the wreckage is where they get the name from. But this was apparently a big storehouse, basically a trade center of some sort at Lerna. Lerna is more famous in the Greek world for the famous story of Heracles. He fights the famous Hydra in the mythology at this particular spot. But the Mycenaeans arrive at the end of this period, and there is some evidence of destruction, so it's not necessarily that they're just migrating in peacefully. We don't really know, but they definitely have now a new presence in the land. And how they interact with the pre-Greek inhabitants is hard to say. Do they displace them? Do they intermingle with them? Most people think they probably basically absorb one into the other. In the Middle Helladic, you've got obviously the Greeks now there, but they're going to take some time to develop into the high period, which we're going to call the late Helladic period, or the Mycenaean era. So around 1600 to 1100 is the high point of the Mycenaean Greeks. Archaeology at Mycenae is the most interesting, at least I think so. I think Mycenae is one of the coolest places in Greece to visit. There are a number of really cool graves there. So if you like grave sites, there are a series of them. First and earliest at Mycenae would be those that are called the Grave Circle B, which seems really kind of counterintuitive. Why isn't their oldest grave site called Grave Circle A if you're going to label them by letters? Has to do with the order that they were found in by archaeologists. So Grave Circle B was actually found later than the more recent Grave Circle A. So anyways, the photo that you see on the slide there is Grave Circle B, and in the background you could see the citadel of Mycenae kind of up on the hill. Okay, so this is lower, it's down the slope from the actual fortress. Most people that go there today don't even really notice these graves as they walk up the road to go up to the citadel. But there were 10 what we call cyst graves found there, and these are basically just shallow pits where the burials were placed. Okay, so that dates to kind of this transitional period in the very early late Helladic. Okay, then around this time you're going to have a transition to more complicated graves. And this is a picture of Grave Circle A. This one is actually inside the walls of the citadel. Wasn't always inside the walls. The walls were expanded at a particular point, which I'll point to later. And here you have not cyst graves, but shafts dug down into the earth. So the shaft graves are much deeper. They would have been covered over with stone. They're actually lined with stone. And one of the neat things about these graves is they were found filled with gold, weapons, and the skeletons of the deceased, including death masks made out of gold. So here's one of the death masks. That's the most famous one. This is often referred to as the Mask of Agamemnon. If you know anything about Greek mythology, Agamemnon was the famous king of Mycenae who led the Greeks to Troy. Okay, so this definitely doesn't date to that time period because the war at Troy is closer to 1200 BC. So this is much, much earlier than any supposed Agamemnon would have lived. As a matter of fact, I don't think this was actually the one that was identified as the Mask of Agamemnon when the masks were first unearthed, but it's one of the best preserved of the death masks. But again, lots of gold weaponry. Here's some example of the weaponry that were found. And some of this is just purely ceremonial. This is a bronze dagger inlaid with gold, and the artwork on it is actually exquisite. You've got these warriors, hunters really, doing battle with these lions, which is very reminiscent of some of the themes we've seen in the Assyrian relief sculpture just the other section ago. And you got an example of these interesting shields that they're using, which seem to correspond to some of the things mentioned in Homer. Tower shields, figure eight shields, things that the later Greeks did not use. But Homer seems to have a remembrance of these earlier types of weapons. Okay, so It makes you think about what came down to Homer in a fairly secure oral tradition. Anyways, that would be the grave circle A. And then you move on after that to an entirely new set of tomb architecture, or a totally new set of tombs with its own unique architecture, which is going to be called the Tholoi, right? Or Tholos tombs, singular, Tholos plural. So there are a number of different Tholoi groups. Usually at Mycenae, they're grouped into 3 different groupings based on a developing refinement. So the earliest tombs, those that date to Tholos group 1, are kind of the roughest. The stonework on the inside, it's not very well, what is it called? Quarried stone. It's not finely finished stone. It's kind of rubble masonry that's kind of stacked together. And what you see in that picture up at the top is the remains of a Tholos tomb, and you're actually looking into what would essentially be a collapsed Tholos tomb. The thing would be domed, or actually not exactly domed. It would have an artificial dome over the top of it. Kind of looks like a beehive. These are often referred to as beehive tombs. And I know one of the groups is doing a presentation on the tombs, the Tholos tombs, at Mycenae. So I'm going to maybe give you a few more examples, but I'm not going to talk a lot about this since you guys are going to be doing your presentations on the tomb architecture. The period of around 1450, remember this would be the time when you start moving into Crete. These people move into Crete. Then you also have some interesting documents that show up from the Hittites. So like I said, the Hittites had contact. Hittites, again, very powerful empire in central Anatolia, and they left behind a lot of written records, and some of these texts are often referred to as the Ahiawa texts. Now, the word Ahiawa has been identified by scholars as the Hittite version of the Greek Aegean. So if you ever read Homer, most Greeks didn't call themselves Greeks. That's actually a Roman term for these Hellenic peoples. But in Homer, very often you come across the term Aegean. Right, so the Greeks are the Achaeans who attacked Troy. This may be a cognate, right? So the Ahiawa may be the Hittite word for the Achaeans, and we definitely know there was contact and relations between these two. You also have some interesting names appear that are not place names or people names, but apparently individual names, like Atarsia, if I pronounce that correctly, which shows up in Hittite records dating to around 1400. And if you know anything about the mythology of Mycenae, the father of the famous Agamemnon was a king by the name of Atreus. So there's been people that have speculated whether or not this Atarsia is a Hittite reference to a particular king of Mycenae that the Greeks would have remembered as Atreus. As a matter of fact, that name is also identified with one of the Tholos tombs we're about to look at, which is called the Treasure of Atreus. But the name basically comes from this mythological figure. Whether, again, this is a historical figure, we don't know. It's possible. It's always possible. Okay, so you've got relationship with the Hittites in this period. Then around the middle of the 14th century, you've got increasing fortification of these centers. And if you remember, around 1380, you see the Mycenaeans withdraw from Crete. So one of the going theories is there's something going on in the mainland, because leaving Crete and then refortifying the cities back in the mainland indicates that there may be some kind of threat. There may be some reason that they're not able to govern across the sea a place like Crete. And if you're expanding your walls, there's usually a reason that you need to expand your walls. So with this expansion of the walls, interestingly, that grave circle A was enclosed within. So you could actually see here in our district reconstruction of Mycenae, the gate to Mycenae, that little roadway coming up from the left, is the main gate. It's also called the Lion Gate. You see the picture of the Lion Gate right below the artist's reconstruction. Gets its name obviously from the lion statues that are up in the triangular portion, which is called the relieving triangle. But this is a massive gateway, and the walls jut out to the side, probably to give the defenders of the city a little bit more ability to attack anybody trying to approach the gate. But just once you enter the gate, walk through the gate and look over to your right, you're going to see the grave circle that we call grave circle A. Apparently it was important enough for them to enclose it within the walls. This was probably, had some kind of religious significance. These are the older kings of Mycenae. And then once you get beyond that, you're up into the higher architecture, the palaces, and so on. But if you go all the way to the back of the site, which most people don't do, every time I've gone to Mycenae, I always like to go all the way through the site to the very back section where you're going to find a cistern. You have these cities enclosing their water supply or their water source during this period, which also tells you they're probably trying to protect their water from outsiders, right? There's always this idea that if you ever have your city attacked and your water supply is outside the city, you will not be able to withstand a siege for very long. And by the way, siege warfare at the time was usually a matter of, starving out a city, surrounding it and starving it out. So, the famous siege of Troy lasted, 10 years. They weren't able to do it, supposedly. But really cool thing about the spring, if you ever go there and have the courage to enter, I guess nowadays everybody's got cell phones, so you've got kind of a built-in flashlight. But when I was first, there without any kind of flashlight, this was probably the darkest place I have ever entered in my life. And I knew it was a cistern. The stairway going down is fairly slick and very old. And I know at the bottom there was a cistern, so I didn't venture too far down because I wasn't sure if it was going to drop off at any point, and I didn't want to plummet to my death. But it's actually not. It's actually filled in today. So if you were to go all the way down to the bottom, you wouldn't fall. But you definitely need a light. You can't see your hand in front of your face in this particular place. Anyways, something is up in the mainland, and then around the end of this period, we have not only. I'm sorry, I should bring this up in a second. I was about to go on to something else, but you've got here is the example of the last phase of Tholos tomb building. This is the treasury of Atreus, which I mentioned a second ago. This is the best preserved of all the Tholos tombs. You could see the artist's reconstruction, kind of a cutaway illustration, which I really like, so you could see kind of how it would have looked. You've got even people put in there for scale, so it's really, really large. The inside apparently looks like a beehive. You think of it almost as a dome-like interior. I don't have a photo of it, but again, it's incredibly impressive if you walk into it, but it was not a treasury, number one, so this is misnamed. It was a tomb, and it's not technically a dome. It's what's called a corbelled vault. Architecturally, the dome doesn't exist yet. They didn't come up with the technology to build an actual dome. We're not going to see true domes until we get to the Roman era, particularly the Roman Empire period. And if I was going to go in and explain this as to why it is not a very good design for obviously it's still standing, so they did it pretty well. But if I was going to show you a corbelled vault from the side, you're stacking blocks on top of each other and then using kind of counterweight to hold them in place, which is why you've got this big mound of earth over the top. Now, without me drawing this, which I usually do on the board in the classroom, it's going to be hard for me to show you without some visuals, and I didn't think to put in any good visuals of this. But the earlier Tholos tombs, as a matter of fact, I'm not going to go back, just for the sake of the conversation, but the earlier Tholos that I showed you from the Tholos Group 1, I said was collapsed in. And it's because there's a tendency for these blocks to tilt inward, and the whole thing comes crashing down like, a house of cards for the most part, except for the lower layer. That's why the vast majority of these tombs, there's no vault anymore at all. Treasury of Atreus is unique in that it's really solidly in place and still standing. There's a few others that are still standing as well. Some of them have some interior supports that have been constructed just because people get nervous that, especially with Greece being prone to earthquakes. That, you never know when something like that's going to collapse on you. So again, this is not a dome. The dome is going to require the use of what's called an arch, and we'll talk about arches later and actually how they function. They're much stronger than a corbelled vault type of a design. Anyways, at this tail end, this is the era of the Trojan War, which I already mentioned, referenced to Homer several times. Troy was a city that was occupied long before its destruction. There were definitely different layers of the city. I've actually included a visual that shows you, a number of successive cities placed one on top of the other, the oldest being the lowest level. This is a mound when Heinrich Schliemann came to Turkey to excavate. This was a place known as Hisarlik, and it's just a hill. You didn't realize actually what's in there until you start digging. A lot of times in the ancient Near East, when you see these apparent hills on the landscape, very often they are the ruins of earlier habitations, just kind of covered over. So here's a great example of this idea of stratified settlements. Dating which level would have been Troy was very complicated. There's a whole history of the archaeological excavation, but most people identify level 7A as the Troy of Homer. Okay, now it was destroyed. It dates to the period that the Trojan War is usually dated to, so most likely there's some history behind the story of Troy. It's hard to say what's historical. We don't have names. We don't have the types of records that can verify anything, but people speculate whether the Greeks had anything to do with it. I tend to be of the opinion that the Greeks took credit for it, so I'm going to go ahead and give them the credit for it. But Troy, remember, is not a Greek city. All right, so this is in Anatolia. As a matter of fact, the city was referred to as Wilusa, and that seems to be where we get the name Iliad from. I'm not going to go and explain how that derives from the city Wilusa, but it does. And the people were Luwian, okay? So that was a unique culture on their own. And again, we get some evidence from this from the Hittite documents, because the Hittites had relations with this territory and this city, okay? Now, back to, fortifying their cities in the 1400s on indicates there's some kind of trouble, but they eventually do collapse. Whatever the situation was, they weren't able to withstand it. And by 1150, almost every city center in the mainland of Greece is destroyed. What causes it? Again, hard to know. It's always been blamed, or at least historically has been blamed, on the Dorian invasion, which I mentioned a second ago with Crete, which would be a new group of Greeks. Okay, so when we get to the historical period, there are going to be different groups of Greeks, tribal groups. Some are called Dorians, others are called Ionians or Aeolians. There's several different groups based on differences in language. That's how they're kind of designated. But the Dorians were kind of viewed as the newcomers. So was there an invasion? Most people say no. Was there a migration? Very possibly. Some people actually go and say that the Dorians were already there. Maybe it was some kind of internal uprising. We don't really know, but we do know that these city centers, these fortresses, were destroyed and abandoned, with the exception of Athens. And it's possible that some of the remnants of this culture took to the seas to try to find new places to live, and this would be the Sea Peoples. And when we went and covered ancient Egypt, you remember I brought up the Sea Peoples during the New Kingdom, particularly with respect to Ramesses III. Okay, because in Egyptian records we do have mention of Sea Peoples. When you get to Merneptah, you're talking again the transitional period around 1200. You've got what's called the Karnak inscription, which is a record of Egypt's first encounter with these peoples of the sea, and some names that are listed there. Ekwesh, Teresh, Luka, Shirden, Sheklesh. Who are these people? Again, this is what the archaeologists try to figure out. The Ekwesh people have tried to identify as the Achaeans. So are these Greek peoples? The Teresh, or the Tyrrhenians, that would be a group that's usually associated with Italy. The Shekelesh, Siculi, that would be the people from Sicily. Sardinians, Shirden. We don't know. They seem to be Mediterranean peoples from outside of North Africa, most likely from the Aegean or further to the west. But again, this is kind of guesswork. Ramesses leaves us another inscription of a second attempted invasion by the Sea Peoples at Medinet Habu. The most famous group listed in this collection of names were the Peliset, or most people now identify as the Philistines. So if you're familiar with ancient Israel, the biblical stories, David and Goliath was a Philistine. So most people do agree today that the Philistines arrived in the region of the Levant after around this time, possibly being rejected from Egypt by Ramesses, who did drive them off. And they do seem to be Greek. Their pottery, their remains of the Philistine cities definitely has some evidence of them being Greeks. So you don't really get that when you read the Old Testament, right? So you don't think of David as fighting somebody like an Achilles on the battlefield, but very possibly a Bronze Age Greek-style warrior, somebody like you would place easily at Troy. But then there's other names that I'm not going to go through there. And again, identifying them, it's hard to do, but that's one of the theories. Now, the question was, how much do these sea peoples have to do with the end of the Mycenaean era, or even the destruction that went along with it throughout the ancient Near East? Because there's a basic collapse throughout the entire ancient Near East. It's not just Egypt that's having problems with the sea peoples. You have sea people raiding other places along the coast from Anatolia all the way down to Egypt. You've got the wreckage of, if you remember, the Hittites themselves collapse around 1150. The cities in Greece are all destroyed. Something big was going on. One theory back in the day was that it had to do with the sea peoples, right? Raiding and pillaging and leading to this collapse. Most people don't buy that anymore either. There does seem to be a lot of interconnection among the societies and cultures and civilizations of the ancient period, where the economies were actually interwoven to such a degree that when you start to have problems in one place, it could very easily affect other places. And it does seem to be evidence of drought and various changes in the weather, climate, that may also have an effect. So it could be just this perfect storm of causes that leads to this massive, what's often referred to as kind of a system collapse at the end of the Bronze Age. But the weird thing is, it actually does end this period, and you begin a whole new period, which we're going to end up calling the Iron Age, which is going to come in. Again, I'm going to throw up here this possibility of a Dorian invasion around this time. Again, mainly rejected today, but there's still some people that hold to it. Like I said, Athens continues uninterrupted. It's also possible that some of the other Mycenaean centers had refugees fleeing to places like Athens, because when we get to the historical period, Athens is going to have quite a large population throughout the region, not necessarily in the city Athens itself, but in the region of Attica. So, and these peoples in later Athens are of the dialect that is associated not with the Dorians, but with the pre-Dorian peoples, okay? So we'll talk about that a little bit later. Anyways, that's the historical overview of the Aegean Bronze Age. Can't see my mouse goes to sleep, and I can't see the cursor anymore, but okay, so that was kind of a lengthy thing, but what I want to go to next is going to be an examination of the religion of the period, because like I've been kind of following a basic pattern, a little bit of a historical overview, then we'll talk about religion, and that's what we're going to go to. What I'm not going to do is I'm not going to talk about Greek religion just yet. I'm actually going to start with Minoan religion, so our very next lecture is going to be on the religion of the ancient Minoans.